Good evening, church. Welcome to episode 8 of our study in the book of Revelation. So, just as a summary, we finished the second division in the book of Revelation last week. If you remember, we've been talking about the fact that this book is divided into 7 sections or 7 divisions. Each of the divisions really focuses on, the history of the church, the advent of the church, and the rapture of the church to the kingdom of God, or the restoration of the kingdom of God through the church and in the church in the world. So chapters 1 to 3 were the first division, and then chapters 4 to 7 the second division. We saw the 6 seals being opened up in chapter 6, looking at the different seals that were opened up there, and we come now to chapter 8. When we see the 7th seal being opened up. Now it's important. The 7th seal is opened up, and it ushers in the 7 trumpets. And I think this is the message of this book, is that or the message of the 7th seal, really saying to us that ultimately and finally in Christ, all of the mysteries of God and His dealings with time is revealed. And we find that in chapter 8, verse 1, the 7th seal is opened, and there's a silence for half an hour in heaven. It's an indication of the importance, that the magnanimity of this the 7th seal being opened. So I think one of the primary questions that people would ask is, why the silence in heaven for half an hour? First of all, I think the half an hour is significant in that in the context of eternity, half an hour is not a very, very long time. It's a short space of time. But the half an hour the half an hour of silence could indicate a silence of awe or even dread for the trumpets to come. So the trumpets that are being introduced are trumpets that show the wrath of God being poured out on the world. So remember, the 6 seals that were opened up revealed the mysteries of God's interaction with time, and the way time is managed, the way time is ordered, in order for us as the church to prevail and to be victorious in the world. So the 6 seals showing the interaction of God in history, but also the way that God manages history for the benefit of the church and for the benefit of His children. We also saw in the 6 seals the coming of the Antichrist, or the introduction of the Antichrist into the world. So the 7th seal opening up here and revealing to us the introduction of the 7 trumpets. Now, trumpets are generally a reflection or an indication of a warning, and we're going to come to that just now. But the 7th seal opens up, and there's a silence in heaven. So I said just now, it could indicate a sense of awe or dread for the judgments that would come, or the calamities that would befall mankind and nature and the world because of the 7 trumpets. But I think there's an even more beautiful meaning for this, for the 7th, for the silence in heaven when the 7th seal is open. We find that immediately after the 7th seal is open, we're introduced to this angel who carries an incense bowl or a censer, and he offers up the prayers of the saints together with the incense before God. And for me, the silence in heaven is really an indication of the fact that heaven pauses. Heaven is listening with rapt attention to the prayers of the saints. And I think that's what that silence in chapter 8 verse 1 is really indicating, the fact that heaven is listening with the rapt attention. And I think being able to see that in this passage. So he says, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Again, the the half an hour period is not as important. It shows a short period of time. But in terms of a vision, a half an hour is a long time, right? So if you're sitting listening to a vision or receiving a vision, half an hour can seem like a very long time. Then he says, and I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. I'm going to come to that when we look at verses 6 onwards. But he says in verse 3, another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. So this is the altar of incense that is being represented here in this heavenly temple, right? So very, very much a reflection of the earthly temple. So very similar look and feel about it. So and if you remember, we discussed this the last time, that John is seeing this vision. He's portraying images that he's familiar with from the temple. Now remember, by this time the temple would have been destroyed. John is writing after the year 90 AD, and around AD 70 the temple was destroyed. But he's remembering images from his experience with the temple, right? And he's seeing this altar of incense represented in heaven, and he sees this golden censer and the prayers of the saints being offered up to God. So the smoke of the incense together with the prayers of God's people went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth, and there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So we find that the mention of this altar of incense is really an indication that God views the prayers of His saints as a beautiful aroma, as a fragrance that is lifted up to God. And we find that the angel takes this the coals from the altar, and he throws it on the earth. Indicating again that the prayers of the saints are what results in the judgment of God upon evil in the world. So in other words, what John is trying to say is that the saints' prayers do not go in vain. They are not ignored by God. And this judgment that God metes out is as a result of the prayers of the saints. In other words, God listens to the prayers of His people. In fact, this image of the coals being taken from the censer and thrown onto the earth is actually an image that comes from the book of Ezekiel chapter 10 verse 2, where we find that a similar thing happens, where the angel takes coals from and spreads it on the earth. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 6 as well, we find that the angel touches his lips with coal, right? So the prayers of the saints are a sweet smelling perfume or an aroma to God. So when you pray, and this is the encouragement of this book, that despite the trials, the tribulations, the persecutions you might go through, but when you pray, God pays attention. The whole of heaven pays attention, and the silence at the beginning is really an indication of this, that all of heaven stops to listen to the prayers of the saints of God, right? So also this concept of the judgment or the wrath of God being hurled out on the earth, or on the on the evil that's perpetrated in the world because of the prayers of the saints, basically an indication to say that God does not forget His people. God does not forget the prayers of His saints. Now let's go on. He says, so remember, he says the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth, and there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Again, these symbols, peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake, these are all apocalyptic language to say that there's judgment about to happen, or there's something terrible about to happen. It's frightening. It brings about an image of fear, and this is not for the saints, but against the people who are perpetrating evil in the world. Then he says, verse 6, then the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to sound them. Now I want to go back to verse 2, and he says, and I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. Now notice that these seven angels are being introduced for the first time here. Previously to this, we saw the cherubim surround the throne. But here we come to 7 angels who stand before God. Now, Jewish thinking spoke about these angels as the angels of the presence. Now, they were called the angels of the presence. In other words, these were the 7 angels, the 7 archangels who presented them to God. And we find in a book called Tobit. Tobit was written in the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew. The story of Tobit is actually set, it's telling a story way back, around the 8th or the 9th century before Jesus, but the book was actually written in between the intertestamental period. But Tobit introduces or mentions the 7 angels, the 7 archangels, and I'm going to give you their names. The 7 archangels: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, or Michael, as most of us will pronounce it in English, Sariel, Gabriel, Remiel. These were the 7 angels, 7 archangels that were in the presence of God, who are represented by the 7 angels of the presence. So these are their names: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Sariel, Gabriel, and Remiel. And we find this in the book of Tobit, chapter 12, verse 15. The names of these 7 archangels mentioned. So in Jewish thinking, the concept of these 7 angels was quite a common thing. It was not something that was foreign to Jewish thinking. So these and John here introduces these 7 angels of the presence. He says, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God." It's taken like he's mentioning it as though people already know what he's talking about. The 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Then the 7 angels were the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burnt up. A third of the trees were burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up. So the angel sounds his trumpet, and we find that there's immediately a catastrophe that starts to happen. So first of all, I want to just talk about trumpets a little bit. Trumpets have several different meanings when we look at the Old Testament. The first one is that trumpets always represent God's interaction with history. In fact, if you look at the book of in the book of Exodus, on Sinai we find God revealing his law to the people in Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 and 19. But we hear that God's voice sounded like a trumpet, or the presence of God was announced with the sound of a trumpet. Trumpets also issue a warning or an alarm. In fact, in Joel chapter 2 verse 1, Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 16, and Zechariah chapter 9 verse 14, we find this concept of trumpets being a sound of warning, or introducing warnings in terms of their sound. Trumpets also call, or they summon people. So Isaiah chapter 27 verse 13 shows that trumpets call. Trumpets also announce the second coming of Jesus. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 52 and 53, we find that we will hear that Jesus will come with the sound of a trumpet. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verse 16, also Matthew chapter 24 verse 31, all speak of a trumpet sound when Jesus returns. And again, this concept of trumpets announcing the coming of the King. So when we hear of trumpets sounding when Jesus returns, the coming of the King, right? So trumpets announce the coming of the King. So when we speak of, or when we read here that the angels are preparing to blast these trumpets or blow these trumpets, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that it's a warning. It's a sound of alarm. It's a warning to people. It's a warning to the world. So remember, these trumpets, the judgments that come with these trumpets are not the final judgments of God on the earth. These are judgments or warnings that are given to mankind right throughout the history of the church age. Now, why do I feel that way? Because if you look at what the word is saying, that these trumpets, the judgments that come with these trumpets, let's read it, verse 7. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burnt up, a third of the trees were burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up. So basically, speaking of a third of nature being affected, or the world being affected. So not everything, not a total destruction, but a third, right? So, and we find that that's a consistent theme right throughout all the trumpets that are burning. A third of nature, or the third of the world, is being affected by it. Now, when we see the trumpets being unleashed or blowing, we find that they actually they represent very similar kinds of effects on the world, like the way the plagues were in Moses' time, the plagues on Egypt, right? And we find that, you know, they affect the earth, they affect the seas, the rivers, the heavens. Basically, what the trumpets are saying is that no part of creation is unaffected. There's nowhere for any evildoer or people who perpetrate evil to hide, or to to say that they haven't heard the warnings of God. So these trumpets are warnings against those who practice evil, basically to say, don't mess with the church, don't get involved with doing evil against the church, because God will bring judgment on those who affect evil. So the question to ask then, why a third of everything? I think 3 is a very interesting number, because if you look at 1/3, that represents a minority. 2/3 represents a majority, and this is the uniqueness of this number 3, or 1/3, 2/3, and 3/3, right? So 1/3 will represent a minority, 2/3 will represent a majority, and 3/3 will, or the full picture, will represent consensus. In other words, total agreement, right? So here, these warnings are released. These warnings that of the trumpets are released, and they only affect a minority of nature, not the majority of nature, not all of nature, but a minority of the natural world. Now, definitely, when the natural world is being affected, people are being affected as well, right? So there's no doubt that there are people who are being affected by this as well. So what are the significance of the trumpets then? The trumpets then stand for warnings that are levied, or warnings that are given out to mankind in general, to say, be careful, do not conduct yourself in evil ways, do not persecute the church, do not bring persecution and tribulation against the church, against God's people, because he will deal with that. So I'm going to read all of the trumpets for you, so we can get an idea of what's going on. So he says, the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in mid-air call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other 3 angels." So we find that the 3 trumpets, or the 4 trumpets that that are sounded, they have their imagery comes from the plagues of Egypt. We find that there was hail and fire in Exodus chapter 9 verse 24, and we find in Joel chapter 2 verse 10 there's also blood that's represented as part of the last days, or part of the judgments of God upon the world. I think John adds the imagery from Joel to the imagery from the plagues of Egypt, just to add more drama and more severity to what he's saying. We see that the sea turns to blood in Exodus chapter 7 verse 20 and 21. Also Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 3. Also again, apocalyptic language in Zephaniah showing the sea turning to blood. We find that there's the darkening of the sun and the moon, Exodus chapter 10 verses 21 to 23. So the imagery here coming from the plagues of Egypt. So basically what is he saying? He's saying that God will mete out judgment, or God will mete out disasters on people and on mankind because of their evil, the evil that they perpetrate in the world. Now, we find that the fourth trumpet sounds, and there's this wormwood. Let's go and just read that again as we look at it. And he says sorry, not the fourth trumpet, the third trumpet. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters. Right, so because they'd become bitter. Now, wormwood is a family of plants known as Artemisia. Artemisia is a kind of plant that has a bitter taste, right? So, but we find in the Old Testament, Artemisia or wormwood is considered the fruit of idolatry in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 17 and 18. There's also punishment that's related to wormwood. Wormwood is given to the people as a form of punishment. Jeremiah chapter 9 verse 14 and 15. Also Jeremiah chapter 23 verse 15. So it stood for the bitterness of God's wrath. Whenever the Old Testament spoke of wormwood or Artemisia, the plant, it was an indication of the bitterness of God's judgment. And this is exactly what the third trumpet is saying, that the bitterness of God's judgment is being poured out on parts of the world wherever people are being are showing their level of evil. Now I want to just discuss a little bit about this, and we're going to find this later on in the bowls that are being poured out later on as we move on from this section. But the trumpets introduce a very interesting concept. The trumpet introduces this concept that the sin of mankind, the rebellion of mankind, causes nature to actually react, causes nature to end up reacting and rebelling against the sinfulness of mankind. Now, this is a concept that is that is right throughout the Bible, that nature reacts, so nature rebels against the sinfulness of man. And we find that the Old Testament thinking, the Jewish thinking, was that the angels, there were certain angels that managed or controlled the forces of nature, and the forces of nature were the agents of God, or agents of God's wrath. So in other words, the more humanity sinned, the more people conducted themselves in this manner of evil or sinfulness, the more nature rebelled against that. So this here is not to be seen as the final judgments of God. No, it's not that. These are the natural disasters that happen right throughout the world as a result of man's sinfulness, as a result of man's rebellion against God. So remember, nature is seen as praising God, as worshiping God. Nature worships God. Nature honors God. We find this right throughout the scripture, that nature is in harmony with God's will for it. Nature is also fallen because of man's sin, but because nature was plunged into sinfulness because of the choice of mankind, we find that nature acts as an agent of God's wrath every time man's sinfulness gets worse. So when we look throughout history, we find that the Bible implies that natural disasters will increase when the sins of mankind increase. Natural disasters will get worse when mankind ends up sinning more and more against God. So the trumpets here representing natural disasters. We're going to find that the rest of the trumpets, the other three trumpets that come later on, deal with spiritual matters, but the first four trumpets dealing with nature. And we find that the range of the broad range of the trumpets, from the earth to the seas to the rivers to the heavenly bodies, in other words, all parts of creation are affected by the sinfulness of man, and all parts of nature will rebel or react to the sinfulness of mankind. Right. So finally, we find that there's an eagle. There's like a pause that happens here, and I think this is a very important pause. So before the fifth angel comes in to sound his trumpet, we find that there's this pause, and there's this eagle that's flying, and he says, and as I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in mid-air call out in a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blast about to be sounded by the other three angels. And this basically brings this chapter, this chapter 8 to a close, but introducing something more dramatic that's going to happen as the other angels prepare to blast their trumpet. Now, this picture of the eagle comes from this book that we've mentioned a few times in previous weeks, the second Baruch. chapter 77, verses 21 and 22, we find here that there's an eagle that's commanded to take the scroll of Baruch and take this message to the people that were in Babylon. So very similar image of in John's mind, this angel that carries a warning or carries the message of God. But again here, this eagle issuing a warning: woe to the world because of the other trumpets that are about to be blown. So just to recap then what we're talking about here, the trumpets represent a warning. And these are not the trumpets of the final judgment. No, these are trumpets that are sounding right throughout the history of the church, right throughout the history of the world. And what we are basically seeing is nature rebelling against the sinfulness of man. Nature becoming the agent of God, the agents of God in terms of bringing about justice in the world. So the more man sins, the more evil the world gets, the worse nature reacts. And sometimes I think practically we can see this when we look at the fact that so often, the worse the world gets in terms of its morality and its ethical standard, the more we find wars happening, the more we find volcanic eruptions, earthquakes all around the world, floods. All of these things tend to happen, and they're part of this whole rebellion that nature has against the sinfulness of man. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter 8, the seals, the seventh seal introducing the seven trumpets, basically showing that the seventh seal reveals the fullness of God's revelation and the mystery of God through Jesus Christ to the church, but introducing this concept of understanding what the interaction of God is in the world. So here we find nature being introduced as the agent of God's wrath, nature showing its disapproval of the sinfulness of mankind or the rebellion of mankind against God. So I hope you've enjoyed it. May God bless you. We look forward to having you join us next week again as we worship and as we worship God through our understanding and our study of this book. God bless you. Thank you for joining us.